Hi everyone, this is the third lecture in the Docker series, and in this lecture we are going to study about a Docker file, how do we create a Docker file, and some things related to that. And after this we are going to take a look at the exercise for today. This is going to be our first exercise. I hope you guys do that, and I will solve the exercise in the next lecture. So let's begin. This is the agenda for today. Again, we have to look at the repository that I asked you guys to clone. If you haven't done that, please take a look at the setup video and please do that. We are going to look at some basic parts of a Docker file. Not all the parts will be covered, but just some parts are discussed, like the base type, some modifications, some ports to be exposed, and a command that will be running. In this lecture, we'll create a simple Docker file. We'll categorize them into the steps we have mentioned above, these 4 steps. These 4 steps are just some simple terms that I'll be using so that we understand the basic building blocks of a Docker file. And then we'll understand and annotate the contents of it. So by annotation, I just mean we'll write some comments over it so we'll understand what those things are. But before we begin, it is quite necessary to understand that what makes a Docker file. So the basic component of any software to run has some 4 parts. The first part, the OS. On top of it, we'll write some software, right? So the OS is the first, or it's called a base type. I'm going to call it a base type. It's not something that Docker says, but I'm going to call it as a base type because this is where we start from basically. Then we add some more libraries. So this is our second step, and I'm going to call it software modifications. So I'm going to call it as software mods. Then the third layer is where we expose our services or the applications that we run over the network. So I'm going to call it as ports, or again it's part of the configurations, but let's call it ports. And a layman term would be something like a config, right? So I'm going to write as conf. And the last part will be the init, right? And let's call it section number 4, the run part, basically. The run part is where you actually run your software. So it can be a small script that you write, some statements that you write. So these 4 parts, we'll look at it, how they are going to translate when we write a Docker file. So let's take a look at how we are going to code a Docker file now. So please shift back to your day 2. I'm going to touch a file called Dockerfile, and I'm going to edit it, and we are going to look at all these parts that I've mentioned in the right side: the base OS, the libraries, some ports, and last, the init step. And let's see how they are going to look like in a Docker syntax. So you're going to create a file called Dockerfile. Please make sure that you name it properly and don't put it into any directory for now. We'll see why we should not be doing this, and if we do this, what all steps are required. Maybe in the later lectures I'll talk about that. But for now, just understand that you have to make it of the similar name, Dockerfile. So once you have done that, move into the Docker file, and the first step, as we saw, is called the base type. I'm just going to annotate it, call it as the base type. In Docker, we use the from keyword, and then we write a name, the image that we require. This statement, don't get confused by it. I will tell you how to find images like this. So this is our base type. In a layman term, it's an OS Linux flavor with Python installed on it. Slim refers to a tag just for the developer identification. It refers to a tag which is a lightweight Python, lightweight Linux with Python installed on it, right? So the next step, some more libraries, and obviously you need to install the libraries. So in Docker you usually write run, and since it's a Linux environment, we have it, apt-get is the way to install packages on it, so we'll be using apt-get. The first part is to update our repository so that we have all the required software, and then we do an apt-get install, and I am going to install the Vim editor. It's not installed by default, but we'll install it, and I'm going to write -y so that we should not be asked for a yes or no while installing it. So install, so this step is called the libraries, so I'm going to call it as install libraries, and then the second step is, and I'm going to also mention that -y is required to force install. Then we have the ports or configurations. How do we do that in Docker? So for now, I'm just assuming that our configuration is limited to just a port exposure. So I'm going to expose a port. That is how you expose a port, right? And usually what we do is that we do some IP tables command in the Linux to expose a port, but in Docker you just have to write expose and then a port number. I'm going to write 9000. Now the last step is the run step. In this we have to run a command. So the short form for it in Docker is cmd. You write brackets and then you write Python, and I separate all the arguments to Python as a token in this array. It's called the JSON notation. Basically it's a JSON array that you pass into the command, so make sure if you have some slash characters to escape them, but I don't have any, so I'm just going to write Python -m, and there's a module called http.server, and it requires a port as well. So I'm going to run it on the same port that I exposed it here. So my service runs at 9000, and I also expose the port above. So I can use this port from outside a Docker container. Now let's save the file, and I'm also going to name it run or init step so that it corresponds to what we have written on this side. Now let's save it. Now we are going to build the Docker file that we created just now. So for that, I'm going to type docker build because I'm building it. I'm going to give a tag called day2, and my current directory is where the Docker file is and all the contents related to it is. So I'm going to type dot, and it started building it, and it's updating some software now. It should be installing Vim now. Yes, if you see here, something related to Vim was installed. It did not ask me about the permission because I've added the -y flag, which means yes by default, and it's running some operation right now. Based on my network, this is going to take some time. So now we can see that the softwares were installed, and after that the step 3 was to expose a port. Step 4 was to run this command, but this was not run as of now because this command will be run when we'll try to run the Docker container. Now we are going to look at how to run the Docker file we built. This was a Docker file, so I'm going to type docker run, and the name of the tag that we gave to it, we gave it day -2, and since we expose a port in Docker, I'm just going to do a port forwarding. We're going to take a look at in the later lecture what does this port forwarding -p option does. But for now, just understand that the port that we exposed inside of Docker needs to be exposed from the outside of the container, and for that we use the port forwarding so that the traffic from outside coming on 9000 port is forwarded to the inside Docker container at the 9000 port, since we have exposed that port inside. So now we are going to run this, and let's see what happens. I did not add an environment variable specific to Python, so that is why I cannot see any logs here. But let's go on to our browser and see what is happening on the 9000 port. So if we go onto the browser and type localhost 9000, we see these files. All these files are present inside the Docker at the root, because the Python command that I ran is starting an HTTP server on the root and sharing the contents of it at the port 9000. So this is what that command does for us. And please note that the cmd part in your Docker file will only run when you run the Docker, not when you build it. We're going to take a look on the each steps of Docker file in the later lectures. But for now, I'm just going to close this docker run command. You could see that we got some log messages as soon as we did a Control-C. That is because Python log buffer was flushed when I did a Control-C. We can have the real-time logging by adding one environment variable. There is one thing that I need to do so that we can see the logging in the Docker file. I'm going to add an environment variable called Python unbuffered. Python unbuffered equals to 1, build it again, run it again, and now we are seeing the logging again. So now as soon as the logs are generated in the Docker, they are automatically flushed onto the standard output. So this is just some environment variable that Python requires, so that is why I've put it here. So we also know now how to declare environment variables. Let's see how we can see this file. So if I refresh this page, you should see another line here because this was accessed, right? Let's go back to the agenda for today. I have updated the agenda and added one more point to it. We are also going to take a look at the difference between a Docker file and a Docker container. I'm going to switch to the drawing mode. So now let's understand that what is a container and what is an image and how they are related. So this is your host operating system, right? And somewhere here is a Docker container. I'm going to write it as DC. And somewhere here on the operating system, on the host OS, you wrote a Docker file. Let's color it differently so we can understand it, right? So this was a Docker file. This is our Docker file. Please recommend in the comments section if you have any options for any other drawing editor that I can use online, because Google Keep without a pen, a stylus, is really difficult to operate, and that is why the handwriting is quite bad. Please refer that in the comment section. Okay, so this is the Docker file and this is the Docker container. Both are right now in the host. Docker file was just a plain text file that we wrote. And the Docker container is basically the environment that allows for this Docker file to be executed, built, and then run. So we can say that the Docker container is an instance of a Docker file. Docker file is nothing but a blueprint. Coincidentally, we have used a blue pen for it, so it's easier to understand that Docker file is just a blueprint. It will not do anything on its own until we place it inside a container that can run it. So when we do a Docker run command, it actually is spawning a container and doing all the steps that we have written in the Docker file to create that container. Docker file is similar to a class file in Java that itself won't do anything unless you place it in a JVM, which is the runtime. Similarly, Docker file here itself is a blueprint. It won't do anything of its own. It's just a plan that will get executed when you put it back here in the runtime, which is Docker container. So that is one analogy that I like to think of when I see Docker file and a Docker container. Now let's go back and continue the agenda for today. So we have covered Docker file and Docker container and the differences between them. We have seen the basic parts of a Docker file. We have related that to the traditional software that we require a base type, which is usually an OS. Then we install some libraries. Then we add some configuration on top of it. We expose a port. And on top of that, at the last, we run a script that can install or run our software. We have created a simple Docker file. We have categorized each and every step, and we have sort of understood what each of them is doing, and we have also commented the sections as well. I'm going to post this code online on GitHub. You can just do a git pull rebase to get the code. I'm going to write that command in the YouTube description. You can follow that. Now the exercise for today is try copying a file into Docker using the copy command in Dockerfile. I have mentioned the syntax here as well. You write copy, then you write the path on your host operating system, and then you write the destination path, which should be existing in your Docker container. For the purpose of this tutorial, you can use a slash so that it copies that directly into the root. So example would be copy. For example, you have something called foo.txt and you want to copy that into the root of Docker. So it would look something like this. Try this command in your Docker file and let me know in the comments section if you face any problem. I'll get back to you really shortly with the next lecture, and in that we'll look into some deeper concepts of Docker build, how the image was built, and what is Docker doing inside it while it's building that image. Till then, stay home, stay safe. Don't forget to click on the subscribe button, and please leave me your valuable comments in the comment section below for any more details you like. Thank you and have a nice day.